Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And we are past the halfway point of the story now. Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet have returned from their wanderings in various other locations and have returned home to Longbourn, and are now in the company of their two imbecilic younger sisters, and also their bookish younger sister Mary, and their mother and their father. And all the excitement seems to have died down. There was a lot of excitement in the first part of the book. Netherfield Hall is let at last, and the man who lets it, a wealthy young man named Mr. Bingley, takes an extreme liking to Jane. They spend all time together. They talk constantly. They ignore company in order to talk. They are clearly in love. But then he leaves precipitously, and the whole party that's with him leaves as well, including Mr. Darcy, an imperious friend of Bingley's who crossed verbal swords with Elizabeth Bennet many times before he left, and does so again when Elizabeth goes to visit her friend Charlotte Lucas and comes into contact with Mr. Darcy, so much so that Darcy proposes marriage, and she turns him down. And he writes her a long letter defending himself on a couple of points, especially the 2 points. One, that his criticism of the bulk of Elizabeth's family as being not quite the thing is just. It's justified by their behavior, which is odd and unworthy. And also that he was right in his cold behavior towards Mr. Wickham, a gorgeous new addition to the militia in Meryton, who had a shared childhood with Darcy and expected benefits from the Darcy family that Darcy withheld. Wickham has given Elizabeth a sob story about his own personal past, and she has believed him until she reads that letter and suddenly starts to put two and two together and realize this account is almost certainly true. So all the while that she does that, Jane is in the big city. She's in London, and she is not seeing Bingley, and she is miserable. And then everybody ends up back at Longbourn, and Elizabeth tells Jane as much of the story of Wickham as she can. But things settle into a normal routine that's disrupted by only one little thing. The regiment that Mr. Wickham joined, that's encamped near Meryton, is leaving. They're scheduled to rotate out. So they're leaving very soon, and this has the two youngest Bennet girls absolutely miserable because they used to like nothing better than to fawn over the pretty officers in uniform, to go over to town and talk to them, to flirt with them, exchange the latest gossip about them, and that's all going to be gone. A major source of their entertainment is going to be gone. And that brings us to where we are today, chapter 41. Another short one, another one that has a bit of a bombshell in it. The regiment, their movements are not secret. They're going to Brighton. They're going to be moved to an encampment outside of Brighton. And naturally, this means that the two younger Bennet girls want to go to Brighton. They want a vacation there during the summer. And Mr. Bennet seems dead set against it. I don't doubt that he would be against it. I mean, he doesn't have infinite money. And these girls burn through what he has. But there is now a campaign afoot at Longbourn to get him to reconsider. Mrs. Bennet would certainly like to go to the beach. She would certainly like to go to the seaside. And that brings us to where we are today. The first week of their return was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighborhood were drooping apace. The dejection was almost universal. The elder Miss Bennets, that's Jane and Elizabeth, alone were still able to eat, drink, and sleep and pursue the usual course of their enjoyments. Very frequently were they reproached for this insensibility by Kitty and Lydia, whose own misery was extreme, and who could not comprehend such hard-heartedness in any of the family. Good heavens, what is to become of us? What are we to do? Would they often exclaim, in the bitterest of woe. How can you be smiling so, Lizzie? Their affectionate mother shared in all their grief, and she remembered what she herself had endured on a similar occasion 25 years ago, when she was a brainless chit who also mooned over regiment members. I am sure, said she, I cried for 2 days together when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought I should have broke my heart. I am sure I shall break mine, said Lydia. If one could but go to Brighton, observed Mrs. Bennet. Ah, yes, if one could go to Brighton, but Papa is so disagreeable. A little sea bathing would set me up forever, and my Aunt Phillips is sure it would do me a great deal of good, said Kitty. Such were the kinds of lamentations resounding perpetually throughout Longbourn House. Elizabeth tried to be diverted by them, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt anew the justice of Darcy's objections, and never before had she been so disposed to pardon his interference in the views of his friend. She has been introduced to shame. She sees her family from the outside now. But the gloom of Lydia's prospects was shortly cleared away, for she received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. This invaluable friend was a very young woman and very lately married, and a resemblance in good humor and good spirits had recommended her and Lydia to each other, and out of their 3 months' acquaintance they had been intimate too. Keep in mind, Mrs. Forster, wife of the colonel, sounds very old, but she's not that old. She's not that much older than Kitty and Lydia. The rapture of Lydia on this occasion, her adoration of Mrs. Forster, the delight of Mrs. Bennet, and the mortification of Kitty are scarcely to be described. Wholly inattentive to her sister's feelings, Lydia flew about the house in restless ecstasy, calling for everyone's congratulations and laughing and talking with more violence than ever, whilst the luckless Kitty continued in the parlour, repining at her fate in terms as unreasonable as her accent was peevish. "I cannot see why Mrs. Forster did not ask me as well as Lydia," said she, "though I am not her particular friend. I have just as much right to be asked as she has, and more too, for I am 2 years older." In vain did Elizabeth attempt to make her reasonable, and Jane to make her resigned. As for Elizabeth herself, this invitation was far from exciting in her the same feelings as in her mother and Lydia. But she considered it a death warrant of all possible common sense for the latter, and detestable as such a step must make her were it known, she could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. She represented to him all the improprieties of Lydia's general behavior, the little advantage she could derive from the friendship of such a woman as Mrs. Forster, and the probability of her being yet more imprudent with such companionship at Brighton, where the temptations must be greater than at home. He heard her attentively, and then he said, "Lydia will never be easy till she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to the family as under the present circumstances." Totally cavalierly. It's his daughter's reputation that he's talking about. He doesn't care. "If you were aware," said Elizabeth, "of the very great disadvantage to us all, which must arise from the public notice of Lydia's unguarded and imprudent manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair." Elizabeth has a point, as always. She has a point. It's not just hurting Lydia. It's not just making a fool of her. "Already arisen," repeated Mr. Bennet. "What, has she frightened away some of your lovers? Poor little Lizzie! But do not be cast down. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth a regret. Come, let me see the list of pitiful fellows who have been kept aloof by Lydia's folly." "Indeed, you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. It is not of peculiar, but of general evils of which I am now complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world, must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurance and disdain of all restraint which marks Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment." Again, perfectly true. It's his job. If not her mother's obviously not going to do it. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself and her family ridiculous. A flirt, too, in the worst and meanest degree of flirtation, without any attraction beyond youth and a tolerable person, and from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, wholly unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite. In this danger Kitty is also comprehended. She will follow wherever Lydia leads. Vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Oh, my dear father, can you suppose it possible that they will not be censured and despised wherever they are known, and that their sisters will not often be involved in the disgrace? He ought to listen to this, but he doesn't. Mr. Bennet saw that her whole heart was in the subject, and affectionately taking her hand, said in reply, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Whenever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued, and you will not appear to be less advantaged of having a couple of, I may say, 3 very silly sisters. Mary is not silly. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man and will keep her out of any real mischief. And she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody. You know how that turns out. At Brighton she will be of less importance even as a common flirt than she has been here. The officers will find women better worth their notice. Let us hope, therefore, that her being there may teach her own insignificance. At any rate, she cannot grow many degrees worse without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life. With this answer, Elizabeth was forced to be content, but her own opinion continued the same, and she left him disappointed and sorry. It was not in her nature, however, to increase her vexations by dwelling on them. She was confident of having performed her duty, and to fret over unavoidable evils or augment them by anxiety was no part of her disposition. I think we've seen that's not quite true, but okay. Had Lydia and her mother known the substance of her conference with her father, their indignation would hardly have found expression in their united volubility. In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw, with the creative eye of fancy, the streets of that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself the object of attention, to tens and to scores of them at present unknown. She saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with young and the gay, the dazzling with scarlet, and to complete the view, she saw herself, seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Had she known that her sister sought to tear her from such prospects and such realities as these, what would have been her sensations? They could have been understood only by her mother, who might have felt nearly the same. Lydia's going to Brighton was all that consoled her for the melancholy conviction of her husband's never intending to go there himself. But they were entirely ignorant of what had passed, and their raptures continued with little intermission to the very day of Lydia's leaving home. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. Having been frequently in the company with him since her return, agitation was pretty well over, the agitations of former partiality entirely so. She had even learnt to detect, in the very gentleness which had first delighted her, an affectation and a sameness to disgust and weary. In his present behavior to herself, moreover, she had a fresh source of displeasure, for the inclination he soon testified of renewing those attentions which had marked the earlier part of their acquaintance could only serve, after what had passed, to provoke her. In other words, he showed partiality to her, almost wooing. Then a young woman in the neighborhood suddenly became an heiress, and he dropped Elizabeth and turned all his attention to that young woman. Then she left town, and now he's turning his attentions back to her, only instead of being flattered, she now sees it for what it is. She lost all concern for him in finding herself thus selected as an object of such idle and frivolous gallantry, and while she steadily repressed it, could not but feel the reproof contained in his believing that however long, and for whatever cause, his attentions had been withdrawn, her vanity would be gratified and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining at Meryton, he dined with the other officers at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humour, that on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time had passed at Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam's and Mr. Darcy's having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he were acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and a returning smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in his favour. With an air of indifference, he soon afterwards asked, "How long did you say he was there at Rosings?" "Nearly 3 weeks." "And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners were very different from his cousin's?" "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance." "Indeed," cried Wickham with a look which did not escape her. "And pray, may I ask?" But checking himself, he added in a gayer tone, "Is it in address that he improves? Has he deigned to add aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope," he continued, in lower and more serious tone, "that he has improved in essentials." "Oh, no," said Elizabeth. "In essentials I believe he is very much what he ever was." Only she knows what that is now. While she spoke, Wickham looked as if scarcely knowing whether to rejoice over her words or to distrust their meaning. There was something in her countenance which made him listen with an apprehensive and anxious attention while she added, "When I said that he improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that either his mind or his manners were in a state of improvement, but that from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood." Wickham knows his goose is cooked. 3 weeks? How could the subject not have been clarified? If only he could read the letter. Wickham's alarm now appeared in heightened complexion and agitated look, and for a few minutes he was silent, till, shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again and said in the gentlest of accents, "You, who so well know my feelings toward Mr. Darcy, will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. His pride in that direction may be of service, if not to himself, to many others, for it must deter him from such foul misconduct as I have suffered by. I only fear that the sort of cautiousness to which you, I imagine, have been alluding is merely adopted on his visits to his aunt, of whose good opinion and judgment he stands much in awe. His fear of her has always operated, I know, when they were together, and a good deal is to be imputed to his wish of forwarding the match with Miss de Bourgh, which I am certain he has very much at heart." Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. She saw that he wanted to engage her in the old subject of his grievances, and she was in no humor to indulge him. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance on his side of usual cheerfulness, but with no farther attempt to distinguish Elizabeth, and they parted at last with mutual civility, and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. They are going to meet again, though. You're never going to be free of this guy for your whole life. When the party broke up, Lydia returned with Mrs. Forster to Meryton, from whence they were to set out early the next morning. The separation between her and her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did not weep from vexation and envy. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible. Advice which there was every reason to believe would be attended to. And in the clamorous happiness of Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more gentle adieus of her sisters were uttered without being heard. So that is the upshot of this chapter. That Lydia is going to Brighton anyway, even though Mr. Bennet doesn't want her to. She didn't turn down the invitation, and he didn't make her. He didn't forbid her from going, as he easily could have done. And Elizabeth's points are exactly right. It is to be expected that she will behave catastrophically when in Brighton, especially away from the supervision of her parents, from the checks and balances of her older sister. She'll be with a flighty young woman, very much the same as she is. Only disaster can result. But the other neat thing in the chapter is that Mr. Wickham knows. He doesn't say it outright, but he knows that Elizabeth knows who he is, what he is. I don't think there's any doubt from that conversation that a lot passed between them that wasn't spoken. So Wickham knows the game is over with her and doesn't want to have anything more to do with her. So there we go. A little bit of stir in the plot, and we'll wrap this up for now and take it up next time. Thank you, Bortu.